Thank you. So I'm sorry that there may be more questions and I saw some hands raised, but I'm sorry we have no time. But Professor Phillips is here and we can anytime converse with him. Thank you, Professor Phillips. And now I have privilege to request Professor Sundar Sarukei. 40 minutes for presentation and 20 minutes for discussion.
Thank you, Prasad. It's a great pleasure to be here and continue this dialogue with this community of educationists, people who are interested in philosophy of education. It's doubly a pleasure to share the stage with Professor Stephen Phillips. I must confess that my entry into Indian philosophy seriously shift from Western philosophy happened through the encounter with your book, Classical Indian Metaphysics, a remarkable book which we still teach our students today, and something which really influenced me to look at certain aspects of Indian philosophy far more seriously. And that, of course, led me to Matilal. We have Professor Tiwari here, who was a very important contribution in editing the book, along with Ganeri on Character of Logic in India, has also been a great source of entry for a lot of us who want to do Indian philosophy and through these kinds of contemporary traditions. So in a sense, I'm like Ekalavya, having followed his work. It's a classical Indian metaphysics, and then this most remarkable book, the recent one called Epistemology of Perception, a translation and commentary of one part of Tattva Chintamani, is really one of the great books in my view, not only to learn philosophy, to teach philosophy, but also to understand the very fundamental nature of philosophizing in the Indian context. I only hope at the end of my talk you won't ask for my thumb, but let me place on record my gratitude for the enormous amount of contribution he has done to a very large number of Indian philosophy people here in India. I say this also because doing Indian philosophy in the Indian context has its own specific set of problems, and one of which, given the fact of the lack of support of philosophy education in India, one of the very important pressures on us in sustaining philosophy in India is to find it meaningful, to make sense of it, perhaps in the context of debates around the country on various contexts. In the last meeting here, the last year's meeting, I wanted to, as I said, my own engagement with Indian philosophy has been trying to make sense of that kind of a contemporary engagement with Indian philosophy. And one of my earlier works was on Indian philosophy and philosophy of science, which is very much about what Professor Phillips spoke about here, Mill's method and so on. It's not about understanding Indian philosophy as science, but as engaging with questions which philosophy of science engages with today, including notions of valid inference and so on. With my own engagement with the philosophy of education community, I've been more and more looking at this question of how do these questions matter to certain fundamental questions in education. And last year I did look at some issues on questions of science and mathematics education and inference, and following the Pramana structure, this time I'm going to talk primarily about the question of testimony and its relevance to the question of language, to the question of education. And I'm very glad that Professor Phillips has already set out some of the basic ideas here, so which I can draw in learning. Given the multiplicity of languages in the country and the judgment of the Supreme Court itself, you would find that this question of language, which seems to be very political, is also very epistemological. What do children learn better in different languages? Do children learn better in one standard language, whether it's English or even mathematics and so on? So I want to, and this is a question which I must also mention has been catalyzed increasingly the work of two of my PhD students, Hasim and Ivan. So I must thank them for this too, because they've been making me come back to this question of asking for this relationship between language and learning. Why is mainstream education so much concerned with certain textual strategies and so on? So in a sense, my coming back to this question through Indian philosophy is just to highlight one of the great strengths of Indian philosophical traditions, and to echo what Professor Phillips said, perhaps to look at very seriously at the study of testimony, Shabda Pramana, as a very important teaching method in our own systems. So I begin with a very simple question, and that's a question between the relationship between learning and language. First of all, you can break it up into many different questions, which includes a point about what is the nature of learning, what is the relationship between learning and education, and what are the different ways of learning related to the questions of pedagogy and so on. Now, if you look at Pramana theory, as Professor Phillips pointed out, and very often we look at these as valid means of knowing. We know something about the world and we know them through specific valid ways such as perception, inference, testimony, and analogy, etc. Now, if we phrase this question slightly differently and ask, what are the valid means of learning? Then we find something very interesting. In other words, we are asking, how do we learn? If we ask this question of how do we learn in the very commonsensical way as teachers, what we do with our students, typically we end up describing the valid ways of learning. One, through perception, we learn by seeing the world. We learn through inference. We learn from texts. We learn from others. That is, we learn through testimony. And when we look at this, it seems to be as if ways of learning are mimicking the ways of knowing. In other words, if we could find an equivalent model of ways of learning, valid ways of learning, as synonymous or isometric mapping with ways of Pramana theory. Now, I don't want to read too much into that, except to point out, when we see this kind of an overlap or one-to-one mapping, isomorphism, it probably is just an indication of the fact that we often think learning is knowing. And perhaps that's not a great surprise. If learning is synonymous in some sense with knowing, that you have known something or the other, then there seems to be the synonymous thing with the Pramana system. So we can then enter into a debate, is a way of learning through perception different from the way of learning through inference in some sense, different from the way of learning through texts. So in a sense, we could draw upon the great debates between these, as he said, between the Nayayikas, the Buddhists, etc., to say, is textual knowledge in some sense derivative of perceptual and inferential knowledge? So for the example of the Yogacara and the Vaiseshika, which he mentioned, if for them the Pramana is only perception and inference, and testimony can in some sense be argued as a form of inference, then you could have an answer to the question of what do we learn from texts, and does textual knowledge or textual learning, can it be reduced to learning through other valid ways, and so on. And I'm just opening up this particular space because I want to look at a specific question here, but this is the background in trying to make sense of how to deal with Indian philosophy for us today. So this is, but this also raises a very interesting relationship, and I think that is a relationship which I want to look at more deeply here, and that is the relationship between learning and knowing, and if learning is the same as knowing, or if it is something more than knowing. And one way to address this particular question is to look at language and its relationship to both knowledge and thinking, or learning, if you like. That is, if you look at the question of language in relationship to this process called knowing and the process called learning, I think there is something very interesting happening there. And I want to explore that by looking at one specific example of the way in which language is used in certain disciplines, particularly in the case of Indian mathematics, and then raise the kinds of questions which I think are very useful for us in making sense of the way we use language in our teaching. So what is the role that language really plays there? Now, if you look at the theme of language in general, in contemporary philosophy, with some resonances in philosophy of education, but I don't see too much of it, but contemporary philosophy of language, of course, has enormously rich debate on this. One, we could begin by pointing out these 2 points. One, language is essential to the theme of knowledge. That it's very impossible to actually talk about questions meaningfully in various academic disciplines today of knowledge without language. So in a sense, it explains why so much of our teaching is actually textual or verbal or language based, whether it's mathematics or the sciences or the social sciences or philosophy. But even in that relationship, there are 2 parts which we can see. One, language in which knowledge is expressed, and 2, the language, the idea of knowledge over and beyond its representation by language. So in other words, what I'm pointing out here is that we do study disciplines. If you look at science or mathematics, for example, you would have a language in which science is expressed. It could use English, for example. It could use symbolic systems like mathematics. But as we know, even in the way in which language like English is used in the sciences, there is a modification to it. There's a nominalistic tendency to scientific writing, influences the way natural language is used in science, scientific writing, for example. So in the writing of the knowledge of science, the constant tension is between whether the knowledge is over and beyond that particular linguistic expression, or whether language has the capacity to completely capture all that there is present within this domain of science or mathematics or philosophy or anything else. So this question between language and its capacity to hold all that we call as knowledge within it is a very important point. And one would argue, and I think that's a very useful way of looking at it, it is because that knowledge does not embody or capture knowledge in its fullness that learning is possible. The very fact that the learning is possible is because there is a gap between these two, representation of knowledge, if you like, and then language which is used to do that. And it is that gap which, both in terms of research and thinking and learning, that gap is where we fill in, we enter in as teachers. So one might make that argument, but I'm saying this because that becomes a very central question to learning. So if I rephrase the question about language and learning, we could ask a similar pattern we've discovered in the learning is one, the language of instruction, which is the language used in teaching learning, and the language of knowledge, which you want to communicate through the language of instruction. So again, for me, a very good example is if you want to teach higher order physics or even whatever, it doesn't even Newton's equations, etc., but through a natural language like English, then what we are trying to do is to say, I have this thing called the knowledge of language, which is Newton's equations in mathematics and so on, technical vocabulary of classical physics, but in a school textbook, you have a completely different representation of it. The language of the text which you use to instruct is very different from the language of the discourse. And we believe in that, either in students learning or teaching, that the language of instruction will capture at least what is essential to the language of the discourse, although both these languages are fundamentally different. And this is a very important question, because I need to know whether I'm actually doing this, and all I have left is language to do it. I have no other way of doing it. I mean, I'm talking about in the context of language. One might say, I'll come back to the question of science teaching and see whether there are other ways to do it. So if we believe that the language of knowledge is very often different from the language of teaching, if that is something which you think is meaningful, then we can look at the consequences of it and ask the question, what is it that one is learning? In fact, I think this is really the fundamental principle on which we can use the question of testimony or Shabda Pramana in answering this particular question. So again, because I want to use a specific example from Indian mathematics, I can start with a very simple question. What is it that a teacher wants a student to learn? And I want to use a very simple example because it's also related to certain characteristics of Indian education which people often talk about. So let me give you an example. A teacher wants a student to learn a multiplication table. So it's, the teacher says 8 times 7, 56. And I'm sure as teachers, all of us know, every time you walk by a school, you hear this wonderful music of the multiplication table, 2 times 2, 2 times 3, etc. And what is it that a student is learning when they are chanting that? Or without the multiplication, if I'm just saying 8 times 7 is 56, what do you think you want the student to learn? What does the student learn from saying 8 times 7 is 56? You could also ask the same thing for even a linguistic sentence, even a verbal language sentence, natural language sentence like apple is sweet, and ask if the teacher is instructing the students to say apple is sweet, what do you think that student has to learn? Where does learning occur? What happens to the sound which the student hears, apple is sweet or 8 times 56, and something else happens? What is that something which characterizes learning? Now, in this context, it's very useful to look at very quickly very different models of education in ancient India, and in our summer school last week we did discuss quite a bit about it. Very briefly, let's look at one model, one of the Buddhist models, which talked about these 3 steps. The first one is the rote method of learning, that is memorizing, learning to make the correct utterance. So you learn in the oral tradition, you are told something, you first learn to first utter it properly, utterance in itself. And 2 is the internalization. So when they talk about the method of education, first you learn this thing to learn to utter it properly, then you internalize it, and 3rd you put it into practice. Now when you look at this model in a very simple way, you can ask what you learn when you start mimicking, uttering the word, the sentence or the expression 8 times 7 is 56. So very often when we talk about rote learning, which we think is an important characteristic, perhaps a negative characteristic of Indian education, which even the National Curriculum Framework talks about, and most of the educational documents I've seen comes back to this question of rote learning. In the context here, I'm going to have a very specific idea. What does it mean for me to say I'm rote learning 8 times 7 is 56? Here, I know what I mean by saying, what does it mean to learn by rote, is that I have learned to utter the right sounds. You tell me 8 times 7 is 56, I can tell you 8 times 7 is 56, and you can go and ask somebody what is 8 times 7, you can say 56, but all that we would be doing in this kind of a language game is to be able to make the right utterances. And I think it's very important to recognize the importance of making the right utterances in the context of education and learning. Because, with due apologies to all of you, academics do this all the time. You can listen to somebody saying something, you ask them something, or you read a sentence, and you know that it is just an utterance of certain words. And what we look for when we do this, when we utter these certain words or write these certain kinds of sentential structures, we want to, when we have this problem with it, we are actually asking the question, we want to voice the sentence, we want to utter the sentence, we want to create that sentence, but we want to know more than that. Somehow in which that utterance converts into something more, which you might call as meaning and so on. But this idea that there's a deeper understanding of that sentence, an understanding of the sentence in this view is not the sentence per se, is not the sound related to the sentence, and all of us can keep uttering the same sentence without understanding it. And that principle that every sentence comes to us with another domain which we hope to achieve and reach really becomes a very fundamental principle of what we think, in an implicit sense also, that there is something to learning which is making this leap. It is also because of this that it makes language secondary. In other words, if by different utterances I am able to come to the same learning process, then language in principle is not that important. It doesn't matter which language I use. I want to teach English, Hindi, Kannada, Sanskrit, whatever it is, I'm able to, from the same utterance, I'm able to make the jump to this. So this kind of a belief about the secondariness of language has been encoded in the way we understand science and maths education. Very quickly, I'm going to just tell you about, just to point out to, couple of work in largely education studies, not even philosophy of education, particularly on science and mathematics education. For example, Osborne, in this work on science without literacy, he points out that teaching science has shifted to, quote, maximal doing and minimal reflecting. And what he points out here is that, quote, as currently practiced, a major obstacle to the learning of science is the failure to recognize the centrality of language activity to science, and as a corollary, the implications for its teaching. And he is drawing upon the fact that even in the discourse of science, the belief that the discourse of science is essentially transparent, that the questions of language are quite different from the kinds of knowledge present in science. That relationship between language and science, which is always problematical, he says has also influenced the questions of science teaching. In contrast, what he wants to argue, following Postman and Weingarten, where he quotes them, and let me read this quote because it's a very simple summary of what I want to say. It is, quote, almost all what we customarily call knowledge is language. Key to understanding a subject is to understand its language. People have done this by looking at mathematics, for example, what is the relationship between mathematical knowledge and mathematical language, and so on. So the question which interested me in this context, particularly of when I hear an utterance, what is it that I learn, whether in the context of, particularly in the context of science and mathematical language, allows me to make this entry into something which I've often found very remarkable about the very nature of mathematical writing in Indian texts. Professor Phillips said perhaps the entry into education is from things like medicine, mathematics, and so on. And I think it's a very good example, and this is something which I find to be of great interest, and I'm sure hopefully it will interest more people to look into this very carefully. Now, if you look at Indian mathematical texts, very seminal texts, ancient and medieval, you find that the way in which mathematics is written is startlingly different from the way in which modern mathematics comes to be written. We know, for example, many of these seminal texts are in verse form. They are Sanskritic verses. They are written in, if you like, a prose form in that sense, which you can memorize, which you can actually speak mathematics. You don't have to write mathematics. A very important shift in the creation of modern mathematics is that modern mathematics is essentially written. But here you have this example of a very rich corpus of mathematical ideas, mathematical knowledge, which are primarily spoken, which are actually primarily recited, if you like. You can actually perhaps add some music to it, and it makes mathematics more fun. But what is it that is happening when they write something like this? So my interest is, primarily to see what is this kind of mathematical knowledge which is present when written in this prose form, and what does this other kinds of modern mathematics do, which this may or may not be able to do. And particularly given the context that we are often told by people in education studies that a large number of students drop out of mathematics also because of this abstraction and the shift into symbolic writing. So I'm very curious to see this particular connection between this Indian mathematics and the nature of mathematical learning. And if you look at, for example, I'm sure many of you have been following this very interesting work on Yukti Bhasha, the new translation and rewriting of the seminal text, the Kerala mathematician's text, which people argue as the first examples of pre-calculus or proto-calculus. Very interesting questions of infinite series, summation of series are all present in that. And in history of science today, this has become a very important text for analysis, trying to make sense of what this text is doing. And this text is a summary of work by the Sanskritic mathematicians, but the book itself is written in Malayalam, so it has a pedagogical purpose. But that has, so if you read that whole text on the Ganita, the mathematics part, and you can translate it into English, it's a Malayalam text, which is talking about very complex mathematical ideas, including infinite series. The first examples of the series, infinite series expansion of pi, etc. are all there. Now, you can look at this kind of a text and ask, what is it that we are actually doing how do they actually talk about mathematics in this form? So I'm just going to give you, I'll just read these few lines just to indicate to you the problems of expressing mathematics through language, and what is the question of what does language do really here, because I want to then conclude by showing you how certain kinds of ways of looking at Shabda Pramana, the way in which we get knowledge through sound utterance, actually is very helpful for this larger question of learning. Now, in one section of the Yukti Bhasha, there is a section which talks about, it's basically about the infinite series. By the way, I mean, historically, I think it's very important to know that the first examples of infinite series, approximation, dropping off the last terms, etc., all occur in the Yukti Bhasha much before it occurs in Leibniz or Newton. Now, in the summation of squares, I mean, so the first section, there's one section on summation of, non-squares. You could say 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus dot to n, then to infinity. In the summation of squares, you'll have n squared plus 1 squared plus 2 squared plus 3 squared. So they're talking about how to do these questions of summation of squares. Now, that summation of squares section begins like this. Now is explained the summations of squares, which the translation is Varga Sankalita. Sankalita is used for summation, different kinds of summation. Now, obviously, the squares of the bhujas, which are summed up above, are the bhujas each multiplied by itself. The bhujas is the word which stands for radius here in a very specific context. But the point what I'm trying to do is not to make sense of the sentence in this very short time, but just to read to you this long, I mean, I won't read the whole thing, but this long one-page verbal writing of what is essentially the summation, which is 1 squared plus 2 squared plus 3 squared plus 4 squared till n squared, what we would write in modern writing of that form, and then there is an equation which tells you what this could be, etc. Now, this is written, in this sense, the way it is written may seem quite difficult to make sense of. For example, the last para ends by saying, thus the longest bhuja is included only in one sum, but the bhuja next lower than the last bhuja is included both in the last sum and also in the next lower sum. The bhujas are etc. I mean, you can already see by looking at this writing of mathematics in this form, in this translated English form of Sanskrit verse, that already it seems so complicated. You have missed one of the most important moments of symbolization which allows you to see certain things or do certain things. But the question remains why this form of writing about mathematics was so essential to Indian mathematics. And how do we make sense of the fact that there is this important relationship between a particular way in which a knowledge is used to communicate something about that particular knowledge, for whatever you think is mathematical knowledge. In other words, we want to believe that when you read this, you are actually asking for something slightly more. That is, you don't want to read these just as sentences. So when, for example, what you're asking for is, what does learning have to do in moving beyond just re-uttering what you heard, which is also a piece of knowledge, by the way. And that's why the first piece of traditional education is about the proper recitation. So I should be able to say 8 times 7 is 56. But in articulating it, I also believe that I should be able to say something more after I have done that, whatever that notion of internalization, etc. is. So just to give you a way, one entry into this problem and how we could actually make sense of it. And I think Professor Phillips' introduction of testimony and the ways questions of meaning, whether words have meaning, whether sentences have meaning, how do the words meaning relate to this, how do words meaning relate to sentential meaning, etc., are all fundamental preoccupations of these philosophers. I mean, they waste centuries debating with each other on what is the basic unit of meaning, etc., etc. And I think there is enormous amount of rich material present in us, present in that, not just for the questions of a few philosophers breaking their heads over words are units of meaning or sentence are units of meaning, but of great consequence to philosophy of education. So in other words, while I agree with Professor Phillips, of course, that direct themes of philosophy of education may not be present in the text, I'm trying to see what a creative re-looking of them or reappropriation of them in some sense allows us to answer certain questions about the importance of teaching children about whether words mean something or the sentence means something. And if sentences are the basic unit of meaning, for example, what is the relationship between word meaning and sentential meaning? And more importantly to me, and this is something which is of personal interest, which I'm trying to understand with this very complex topic, is to ask the question, how does this meaning of a sentence or a word occur in us? In other words, what is this cognitive capacity in us to make meaning from listening to some sound or listening to a string of sounds which we call as a sentence? And that kind of a way of description, which Indian philosophy is always about cognitive descriptions in a very fundamental sense, I think has, to me at least, for me at least, it makes me understand something profound and simple about the nature of learning. So when I'm hearing a sentence, 8 times 7 is 56, what is the process of making sense of it? And through that process, try and understand what is it that I would eventually learn. And as I said, you could of course do this across sentences. It's not just about mathematics, it's about various kinds of sentences and so on. When I say sentences, we're talking about natural language, verbal language, and that's why I brought the question of mathematics, which is written in that language. So for those who might think mathematical writing is very different and we cannot use this model, that's the reason why I was showing you how Indian mathematical writing itself, by being presented in this particular verbal form, allows you to ask the same questions even to scientific and mathematical writing. Now, in the way this is discussed in testimony, in the way this question has been posed, it arises as follows. So, as Professor Phillips pointed out, there are various conditions for utterances to make sense to us. Other than the fact that the hearer understands the language, the speaker and the hearer share this common sense of language, etc., there are also these what are sometimes, or what Matilal calls as auxiliary conditions, such as the semantic similarity, the relationship, the yogyata, and the akanksha, the syntactic expectation that when you use a word, you know what kind of a syntactic grammatical word might go with it. You don't want, for example, the second condition as two words that are completely dissimilar to be attached to each other. And also the proximateness, you don't want to utter one word today and another word tomorrow. And these are very important ways in which are conditions, basic conditions for speech communication to happen. But more important than all those conditions is the question of what really happens to you when you listen to your sentence. When a hearer listens to this sentence, what is this cognitive process which happens, and what is that process of learning that happens by listening to these set of sounds? And I think that that great detailed explication of this process and this disagreement between various schools on this process gives us a kind of an awareness of how to approach this problem. So I'll just give you very quickly an indication of why this is of so central importance to any question of learning in a child or adult or whatever. That is, using language to teach also means that we need to be aware of how language does this job of teaching learning. What is the role of language? So not, in other words, putting the agency back into language and not in the speaker or the utterer of language. One part of testimony, which again Professor Phillips pointed out about Apta and so on, is about trust and belief in the speaker who speaks, and you trust that person for what he says and so on. That's one part. But the part which happens in learning, if learning is happening in an individual, is what is happening to me when I listen to that word or sentence and trying to make sense of that process by which I can make sense of this. And I think, to me at least, personally, that's been one of the great ways of engaging learning about Indian philosophy, has been trying to understand this process. What really happens when you listen to this sentence or a set of sounds, and how it cognitively leads to that moment, what they would call as a knowledge episode. So not knowledge as a particular kind of a statement which is used for analysis, but a kind of a knowledge episode. You say, oh, now I have understood, now I have learned, whatever it is. So in other words, you are bringing in a very, perhaps in a more useful sense to constructivism, it's to bring in not just the question of students learning, but the experience of students learning, which is articulated. At what point does a student say, oh, now I have learned, now I have understood? What is it that has happened to them when they say that? And what is the role of language? What is the medium of language which allows the students to come to that state when they say, now I have understood, now I have learned this. Now, if you look at that, you find, again, there is this a very interesting chapter by Matilal in Word and the World called Knowledge from Linguistic Utterance. And the knowledge from linguistic utterance is just a kind of a summary of the ways in which we actually get knowledge from listening to this sound, whether as words or a sentence and so on. The idea here is that there is a particular episode, a cognitive episode called Shabda Bodha, which is that moment in which it is this awareness of the knowledge episode, or as Matilal says, it could also be the content of the knowledge episode, what you have finally learned. And the debate between these various philosophical schools is, what is this Shabda Bodha? Where does it occur? What is the process? What is the kind of content you may get from a given sentence? So you could do this, as I said, for 8 times 7 is 56, or like what Matilal does, he does this for this sentence, Rama cooks rice. And I just want to give you an example of that sentence because it gives us a way of meaningfully entering into this question. So suppose I listen to this sentence, Rama cooks rice. There are different kinds of cognitive possibilities which may arise in you. Now, if I'm going to keep uttering the point Rama cooks rice, then I have not learnt anything about Rama cooks rice. The fact that from hearing the sentence Rama cooks rice, I should be knowing something, whatever that knowing is that is really at the heart of what I learned through language. What is knowledge from linguistic utterance? So in other words, like knowledge from linguistic utterance, I'm asking what is the learning from linguistic utterance? Given qualifying this point by saying that earlier we saw that perhaps there's a synonymity between learning and knowing. But if I ask what is the learning from linguistic utterance and I hear the sentence Rama cooks rice, what exactly am I actually knowing, and therefore what is that I'm learning? And Matilal looks at different schools which look at this question of what is it that you learn from this and so on. So just to emphasize this point, I'll just go quick through them very quickly, but just to emphasize this point that Rama cooks rice uttered repeatedly is not granting knowledge, but there is something about the sentence which we do know after listening to it, after thinking about it, after having the appropriate knowledge episode for it. What could that be? For example, if I listen to this and say, why is Rama cooking rice? He should be fighting a war. That perhaps is not the kind of a knowledge episode which is possible. I mean, that could become under part of doubt and doubt cognition and so on. But we think, or at least in this point, what Matilal pointing out is how the grammarians, the Nayayikas think about it, is to is to tell us what that cognitive knowledge episode. So I'm qualifying this so much because when I read what he says it sounds very convoluted, but I think a moment reflection and our own learning of this sentence, where that learning happens in us, you will see it actually is something really profound. So for example, he says the early Vyakarnas, the early grammarians say that the Shabdabodha corresponding to this sentence, hearing this sentence, what they think they are getting out of, what the knowledge corresponding to the sentence is the statement, it is the activity which is presently taking place, which is tied to the substratum, which is identical with one single Rama, and which is conducive to the softening located in the substratum, which is identical with rice. Now definitely this does not seem to be like what you learn or know from hearing that Rama cooks rice. But I would also suggest very strongly that this is exactly what we learn, or modifications of this. That you do not learn Rama cooks rice from listening to Rama cooks rice. I am convinced about it, and I am sure many of you perhaps are convinced. Just like you do not learn 8 times times 56 is just 8 times, the sound 8 times time is 56. If you know more, what is it that you know more? And that articulation is what this Shabdabodha is really trying to do. And here is the one way to understand. So let me give you the later grammarians, according to Matilal, quote, the new school is going to say this: the activity of cooking occurring in present time has an agent which is identical with Rama, or is qualified by Rama as its agent, and qualified by rice, which is connected with it by way of being its object. To me, these are like eureka moments. I really understand. To me, it's a knowledge episode when I read this, because it tells me, when you say Rama cooks rice, and somebody asks you as a teacher and as a student asks you, what do you mean when you say Rama cooks rice? This is what we are saying. In other words, the notion of what we expect learning to happen is happening at this level. So what is he saying? The activity of cooking occurring in present time, that Rama cooks rice already has within it a cognitive capacity to realize that there is the activity happening in present time. Because you could have a marker Rama cooked rice, and then you could ask, what is your knowledge episode corresponding to that? So in other words, this is something perhaps which Russell would be very happy with, in a sense that every sentence is a shorthand for much larger expressions, but that's a very different kind of an analysis which Russell would do for this particular sentence. But here you say, the activity of cooking occurring in the present time has an agent which is identical with Rama, and qualified by rice, because you could cook anything. You need not be only cooking rice. You could be cooking milk, you could be cooking meat, you could be cooking vegetables. The fact is that our learning and understanding and knowing from this linguistic utterance is also to recognize what are the correct qualifications which capture the meaning of each word. So if you look at it as a simple linguistic model and ask Rama cooks rice, how does meaning of this occur? If you put it in the context of meaning, then you would say there's a word meaning for Rama, which is a particular agent, which could be denotative meaning, which Professor Phillips pointed out. Cooks could be a very verbal term, doing something, and rice is that thing which you're cooking. Now, what these Shabdabodhas, all these Pramana people are looking at is to ask, when I'm listening to the Rama cooks rice, knowing, or to me even learning in this sense, is characterized by the fact that I know what specific qualification captures the use of cooks here. What specific qualification captures the use of the word Rama here, and what specific qualification captures the use of rice here. So the distinction between what the Nayayikas do and the Mimamsakas do and the grammarians do can be different, depends on the focus of these three terms, but basically it is about clarifying and qualifying this notion of what Rama means, what cooks mean, what rice means. And therefore, in Shabda Pramana, and I'll end with this here, and in this long debate on the question of philosophy of language, this question of whether words make meaning, words together make meaning, etc., are very relevant to making sense of the sentence, because one of the arguments would be, just by knowing the word Rama cooks and rice are three different words, the Rama cooks rice does not lead to a cognitive episode without something else happening. And what happens is that these words come together by removing all the other sets. So if cooks can do 10 different things, but I choose rice in this sentence, and cooking can be done by 100 people, but I choose Rama in the context of cooking, and therefore that combination really gives me a notion of what learning of that sentence really is all about. Okay, and I think this approach, which is really rich and has a lot of scope for mining and re-looking at some of these issues on learning in the Indian context, allows me to offer this programmatic mode. And I think in the context of this very beginning attempts to relate philosophy to educate, Indian philosophy to education, I apologize if it is sounding programmatic, but I want to suggest to students and others that there are very useful ways of doing this thing. And that there's enough, as Professor Phillips said, there's so much of rich material, so much of very clear, careful thinking about these ideas, that even a very simple question of what is a student learning from one simple sentence you tell her there is an enormous scope of finding very useful ways to engage with it. Thank you.
Almost 17, 18 minutes are left for the discussion. And only one thing I want to comment is that language is essential not only for learning or for getting information, but for constructing new knowledge also. When we talk of Shabda Pramana, this doesn't mean that who knows what Shabda says. What the word says, who knows? So the Shabda Pramana, it means the sentence, even the Tattvamasi or Aham Brahmasmi, they have to be interpreted. And that's why every sentence that is called as Mahavakya or that is Shabda Pramana, they are all interpreted in so many different ways, and that's all due to the game of the language. The same Gita text has been interpreted into 100 ways. So I think that's the potentiality of the language itself in the process of learning. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Yeah, okay. So first, yeah.
In me speaking, you have a child operating, say, in more than one language system. The child might be in a vernacular, then there might be some standard form, and the subject might be mathematics or language. I think the imperative is to teach in the form that is closest to the child's experience. I think that communicates best the child's experience. Now, if the child's experience is not the form of the textbook and so on, then we have to privilege, if the child is even in a dialect, from the teacher's standpoint, whatever the form that it takes to best communicate the child's experience. I wonder what the philosophers have to say about this, whether they would be willing to go to where the child is, even if it's the dialect and it's not the standard form, to make sure that the language that is used in the classroom fundamentally connects with the experience of the child.
The second?
Good morning, everybody. It's a very interesting talk and also very thought-provoking. When I had worked for Total Literacy Camp in 1989, we had National Literacy Mission. The aim of the adult education is Akshara, Arivu Mattu Kriyashilate, the word awareness and the creativity, the same concept it is. And we had Shwaram Karant introduce his textbook in primary school some years ago, and he spoke about sentence method and the word method. And also Paulo Freire spoke about his action, reflection.
Please
and
ask the question.
Yes.
Yeah.
So my question is, as rightly said, what is the anubhava here? Like experience of the person who learns. Without any experience, does this sentence make any meaning? For example, Rama cooks rice. If I am a feminist or if I am a gender sensitive, I will think about why Rama cooks rice, why not Sita? So is it the experience makes it different, or is it the word itself, can it convey something? That's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, third one, yeah.
I am confused. I mean, I have this question from my reading of Vygotsky, who is a cognitivist and who has worked intensively upon this aspect of thought and language. And he comes up with, he interestingly brings out the everyday common language, and then how scientific concepts and then interconnections and then how learning happens. So I was wondering if your presentation can acknowledge this, and also whether this is the work of Vygotsky and other cognitivists like Chomsky and all have some relevance in your exposition. I mean, what do you have to say on whatever they have done?
So I liked your last emphasis on, what are the various possibilities in Rama cooked rice. Though, of course, from a linguistic or a cognitive linguistic perspective, you can see that just the XY or XFY construction, even if there's no, it's very semantically light, right? So you could replace Rama by something else, but that still carries a lot of semantic information, right? So the profiling is on the X. So you know that Rama is the subject of the construction, even though, so if you're a child learning the language, you may not know what Rama means, but you know that Rama is likely to be the committer of the action and so on. So I think that there's a lot of information, even in the nature of the construction itself, independent of the lexical semantics of those terms. And I think that actually helps you build a lot of knowledge independent of your knowledge of the specific entities there.
I had 2 points. One is similar to what Aruna said. What do the classics say about language and thought before you go to learning? While Vygotsky had one view, Piaget had another view. So what is the Indian classical view on language and thought before we go to learning? And the second point about deconstructing this sentence, I think Professor Sarangpani has already explained this quite nicely in her book about the 2 kinds of understanding that lead to knowing, which is lexical and referential understanding. And your question about feminist idea, all would fall into the referential understanding, and the lexical understanding is, of course, just knowing the meanings in the particular language. So I think we have to step back once and think about how language and thought is first conceived before we go to learning.
I was actually intrigued because when I had worked on the concept of learning, I almost felt that we educationists need to work with the idea of knowing much more than the idea of learning, which sometimes allows you to have, does not allow you to have deep cognitive experiences that are actually significant. So I was actually wondering that you are bringing the idea of learning into philosophy, which typically doesn't have actually anything to say about this notion of learning. And I feel that it's not doing enough because it allows us to have too linguistic a formulation of what's going on, and that's not adequate to what we want to achieve in education. I felt that learning allows, I think it has to do with the history of education and the possibility that a lot of third-person knowledge is really what is happening. I mean, a lot of Shastric knowledge is getting transferred, but we are today in education much more concerned about first-person experiences. So we do want to shift from the idea of learning to the idea of knowing, and I thought that somewhere we'll have to reflect on that your formulation is much more in the third person still.
Okay, thank you so much for these comments, and I do realize.
One more question, yeah.
Oh.
So, if we see that language is an important tool of learning and knowing, then what happens to the children which are visually or hearing impairments and cognitive impairments? Is there some possibility of cognitive possibility for them in learning and knowing? So, if there is, what are they?
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
Professor Sarkar, let me say how fascinating, in fact, exhilarating presentation you have made here. And I'm particularly gratified as a student of Matilal to see how you have dissected his beautiful sentence, which some of us thought only we can be excited about. My question is limited to language because you have foregrounded the language in the process of learning, and we all know how important it is. and of course, you gave these narratives of hearing and what happens, which of course is parallel to Shravana, Manana and Nididhyasana, and of course also to Upadesha, Lakshana and Pariksha. These two pairs I see as a parallel. But coming back to the language, how do we isolate that language? And you spoke about two kinds of languages, natural languages and language of communication. Now, it is in this context that the 6th century philosopher Bhartrihari is misunderstood completely. And let me just quote this verse, you may have read about it or read it, and Professor Phillips perhaps can enlighten later. Nasusti pratyayo loke yaha shabda anugamadrite anuviddhameva jnanam sarvam shabdena bhasate. When he says that every knowledge, there is no knowledge which can come through without being influenced by Shabda. Now that Shabda to me is a language. I don't know whether we take it as a natural language or a language of communication, but Bhartrihari is somewhere around. So as I was listening to you, I was thinking about Bhartrihari throughout, because it is this verse which has in fact driven Matilal to write that book which I know, the Word and the World. And so I was wondering where would this Indian philosophical discourse on language, whether Professor Phillips can also pick it up if he wants to, where would that language fit in our modern context of communication of either rote learning, and what happens when we hear? Does it propel us to Manana, to the next stage, and then we come to Pariksha, the Nididhyasana, or is simply that it is preconceived that we simply know about it? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just make very brief comments. I think many of these questions are very rich, and I have to let the knowledge episode happen and I read them again. To work backwards, didn't talk about Bhartrihari here because the metaphysics of Bhartrihari is, often for many people who listen to it first time find. No. So I'll explain that. Sorry. Why I'm saying that is, I agree with you. In fact, why I didn't mention him here, because I should have mentioned in the context of this debate. But because that the metaphysics association of this complete centrality of language in the world rather than and the world is so important. But it needs a different way to set up. But in my earlier work on the Indian philosophy and science, the last chapter is only on Bhartrihari, because I realized that's the way I make best sense of the fact in which, for example, modern mathematics is understood and so on. So that is one thing which I can talk to you about, and I think it's also something which I struggle to understand. I think it's really difficult material, but I'm very sympathetic to that, because I think that's a very important way to understand way in which Galileo's claim that the language of nature is the language of mathematics can be made sense of. Again, the visual impairment stuff is a very important question. Let me also point out very clearly, also in reference to other questions, I was focusing on one very specific question and not a very general. In fact, part of this we did in the summer school, where we did extensively on language, looking at theories of language and so on. But for this paper here, it's a very specific question of trying to see what is the role of verbal text or language in processes of learning. And that also comes back to the question of what Padma was asking. It is focused on language because that is a question I'm asking. I'm not saying all learning is reduced to language, but I was interested for this particular debate we've been having with our students and others. What does a text actually do? What am I learning when I'm listening to a sentence? And as I said, particularly in the context of looking at mathematical education when written as verbal language. So I think, I would agree at this point that this question of learning is probably much greater, but after doing this seriously, I have some questions about it, but I don't even venture to enter into that. I'm really trying to understand, if we teach children so much through text and language, what is this process philosophically? How have people in the Indian philosophy? And also, I must tell you that the terms of reference is also very clear to me, because I'm looking at how Indian philosophy, and not do comparative philosophy even with contemporary philosophy of language, because they need a different structure. You're building a building with glass and another building with bricks, and we are asking, what is this glass and bricks doing? So my terms of reference is very clear. What I wanted to do was to say, how do I look at the relevance of certain Indian philosophical systems in order to answer this question? If I teach a child sentences or words or whatever sounds, what is it learning which can occur through that, right? So in that sense, it's limited, but I think the question of what you are saying about learning and knowing is a very important one, and I think there is a gap, but in this context of Indian philosophy of language, I have not articulated that gap, what else constitutes learning. Now, the big problem of it also goes back to the previous question about language and thought, and also lexical and referential, which Rajesh was saying. He was talking about Cook and Rice. The lexical, referential, and language and thought question is the fact that, very often and this is a problem of doing Indian philosophy in English, let us say, because we are using terms which we seem to think we understand. So, for example, when I say thought, I think I understand that word, what it means. And that's really the Indian philosophical question. What do you understand by the word thought? Now, the problem is the link between language and thought, very important for philosophy of language in the Western tradition. And I'm not saying Indian tradition. For example, I think even Matilal points out that for Bhartrhari's context, language is thought and thought is language. He does uses that. But there are very different metaphysics of thought which occurs in the way Indian philosophers talk about, if you want, thinking or whatever. It's a very different way. For example, the Descartesian binary will not occur here. For example, so it's very difficult for us to communicate it. So if I tell you that the species of mind is not this mental, different metaphysical world in contrast to the physical as it is in Descartes, but it is something as a species of the material for the Sankhya, for the Nyaya. I mean, this whole question of different types of minds, whether minds are species of the material or the mental. I mean, then what happens to this question of thought? So the language and thought hypothesis in contemporary cognitive science and philosophy of language is very much dependent on this post-Descartesian dualisms of various kinds. And that's why it becomes a very fundamental question. I must also mention, actually Arindam mentions this in the foreword to This Word and the World, that the question of language has been fundamental to Indian thought. I think even in Professor Philip's book, you come back to that question in various ways, it's so fundamental to Indian thing, whereas Western philosophy of language, I mean, Arindam is exaggerating a bit when he says it's in the 20th century, but it's true. You look at the long tradition of philosophy of language in the Western tradition, it does not seem to engage with the fundamental preoccupations of philosophy of language in the Indian philosophical traditions. So I am saying, it's not that to ask this question I have to first go back to language and thought. To ask the language and thought question I have to go back somewhere else, which is not relevant in this case. And this may sound like a way of escaping this question, but I'm trying to say that the conceptual vocabulary we need in order to make sense of this question is very different from what these people would directly do. So for example, when they talk of cognitive episodes and you're having a knowledge episode, when you listen to a sound, a series of things happen. When you have an inference, a series of cognitions happen, and then you have an inferential cognition, or you have this cognition. That's a very different way of discussing. Now, if you want to think that thought is something which is dispositional, outside a capacity, it is something which I can look at, do things with it, etc. For the Nayayik, for the Indian philosophers, it might be a very difficult question, because thought just happens, and you have to have the conditions under which thought happens, right? So these kinds of analysis, I think, and that's why I'm saying there's a lot of rich different ways of approaching this question. So Vygotsky is a very important thing, and what little I know of him, I've used him earlier in something else which I was doing. I find it of use in making sense of some things, learning processes in contemporary terms and so on, maybe in contemporary education system and so on. But I don't see any disjunct between what you would ask in terms of cognitive processes of learning, whether it's Vygotsky or the Nayayikas or the Mimamsakas, because you are asking questions of what is it that is happening when I say something, when I say do something, what is it that is happening that is making the agent do something? So the relationship between language and action, for example. When I'm saying add 2 plus 3, what is it that is happening that makes the student add 2 and 3? You can describe it as cognitive processes, but those processes I do think share a lot of similarity. But I think people like Rajesh and others might be able to help us out with that, because you need to make that connection between a cognitive model of experience in a particular form and this. So and I agree. I mean, Rajesh's point about, yes, these are all terms, etc. But I think what is very interesting also about this Rama cooks rice, etc., is this way in which we make sense of the connection between words. How do we actually make sense of these words? Yes, the replaceability is very interesting. So the different schools are asking what is replaceable. I can replace Rama, I can replace cooks, I can replace rice, and then what do I do with this? What becomes very important in my cognition and so on. That is a very fascinating discussion, which I think Matilal introduces us to, and I hear Tiwari has a new book on this coming out, so perhaps we'll read more of that on that. But all I'm just pointing out is in this programmatic sense, what we can actually be able to do very meaningfully in answering contemporary questions of education. And that also answers the question of Sita cooks rice, Rama cooks rice. That's really not the question here, in the sense that how do you get a cognition of Sita cooks rice? You know, in the way, what kind of a knowledge you get out of the sentence Sita cooks rice or Rama cooks rice, right? Here they're talking about this episode from any utterance you might make and the kind of knowledge or thing you might get from that utterance. So what does that mean, etc. So in that sense, it looks like in this sense, a very cognitive science understanding of it. But I think the larger question, which is also related to the dialects, forms of language closest to child's experience and so on, I think with the way we understand these people, at least, and I hope Professor Phillips will correct me, is that largely these are theoretical or meta-theoretical enterprises where certain processes which are common in our ways of understanding the world are present and available to us. Now, you as a theoretician, how do we understand that process? So all of us make inferences. Now for them, the question is, really to make sense of the way we make inferences and to explain the inference to you. Why do you make such an inference? Why do I make such an inference? If that is the larger condition, so they are already working at this, this theoretical level of making sense of the experiential. So this is a question which I want to place in the larger context of the great politics between experience and theory in contemporary academics or contemporary post-rational tradition, particularly in the Western tradition. Is there a great disjunct between experience and theory? Does theory step outside experience in order to talk about experience? And do you need a theory which you need to step out of? The Platonic great idea of Plato that your theory is an extraordinary act where you step outside the empirical in order to talk about the empirical. Now, if that is the case, the question here, and just like what linguistics as a science does, yes, it is true that experience and knowledge and language and learning is probably best done. In fact, it's probably, best done perhaps in the language in which the child experiences or learns. But then for modern academical system, then you have these very problematic questions of scientific language, mathematical language, technical vocabularies in philosophy and other languages. What is it? How do we then bring that question of experience of mathematics and science back into the language of the children? And I'm sure, as you know far better, that in mathematics education, this is going to be a big question about how do you teach mathematics through these abstract symbolic terms, mathematical terms, or through doing with hands and so on. But it's just an open question. In this particular talk, I would have very little actually to say anything meaningful about this. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, both the speakers and to the audience. Thank you.
Thanks to the speakers in the audience. We'll break for tea now, and we'll be to the chair as well. We'll break for tea now, and we'll be back at 11:20 exactly. And one humble request is that you're all requested not to bring teacups or biscuits inside this auditorium actually. And parallel sessions will run throughout the day, one here and one in the lecture hall. Thanks a lot.